Welcome, everybody. Glad to see everybody's here. Welcome to the Santa Cruz Queer History webinars. My name is Rob Darrow. I'll be the facilitator for this webinar. These webinars are co-sponsored by the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, or the MA, and the Santa Cruz Diversity Center. We hope that once the pandemic is over that you'll come to Santa Cruz and visit the MA and see the Santa Cruz Queer Santa Cruz exhibit in person. The online exhibit is now open. If you just Google MA Queer Santa Cruz exhibit, you'll find it. We're learning as we're going a little bit as far as these exhibits, as these webinars. Just some quick ground rules. If you are just listening in, we're glad you're here. If you could mute yourselves and feel free to add into the chat room as we go. I wanted to share just a little bit of background. Again, if you've got feedback, feel free to, you can email me at robdarrow74@gmail.com or check it out on my website. So here's just a quick glimpse of the Santa Cruz MA Queer Santa Cruz exhibit. If you haven't seen it, there's the website. And it's fun to see bits and pieces of it, and part of this webinar is enhancing the history that goes with that. For people who don't know, the Queer Santa Cruz history really parallels the national LGBTQ history movement. People in Santa Cruz County have impacted the national rights movement in so many ways, and you're going to hear more about that today. At the very beginning, Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz and Cabrillo College helped impact the overall direction, and Santa Cruz County as a whole has been a pretty inclusive community for many years, which has allowed lots of people to be who they are and to share important things with other people. So again, just to put it in the context, in the 1950s, we had the Lavender Scare. A lot of LGBTQ people were kicked out of government and away from the military. Lots of people went into the closet and stayed there throughout the 50s and 60s. We had the Magick Society that started in LA, and then the Daughters of Bolitas that started in San Francisco in the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 60s. We had the Compton's Cafeteria Riot that was in 1966, and then we had the Stonewall Riots in 1969 in New York, which some people consider that to be an important event in LGBTQ history, which it is, but there was lots of history before that. And around Santa Cruz, it didn't take too long after that for important things to happen, like the first Santa Cruz Pride event in 1975. And then as far as the Radical Fairies, which we're talking about today, it's important to note that in the 70s, there was this women's music festival that was going on around Santa Cruz, but also in the 70s, this guy by the name of Harry Haig, co-founder of the Magick Society, also brought people together for the first gathering. And then in the 80s, the Radical Fairies became part of Santa Cruz culture and began to organize. And just to share a little bit more about that history, in the 80s, the Fairies began to gather around Santa Cruz. They participated in Santa Cruz Pride with creative floats. Anybody who's been around Santa Cruz Pride for years always knows of the Radical Fairy float, and they look forward to it every year. The Radical Fairies also helped to implement the Queer Youth Leadership Awards around Santa Cruz, implemented the Queer Santa Cruz Camp for Youth. Many of the Radical Fairies have been Grand Marshals in the Santa Cruz Pride Parade, and I'm going to share a couple of those photos with you. Here's a picture of Queer Camp that's still going on today because of that. And here's an article that Terry, who's going to be talking today, wrote about the beginning of the Queer Youth Leadership Awards back in 1997. And then here's some pictures of different individuals who were important people that were part of the Santa Cruz Pride, and different vision of different people. And then here's some pictures of the different floats that have occurred over the years. And then a few more here, and the Radical Fairies always have made a broad, wonderful statement across Santa Cruz. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now at this point and invite the people who are here today to talk more about who they are and what they did. So to start with, I wanted to ask each of the participants here to talk about what brought you to Santa Cruz and what originally got you connected to the Fairies. And I'm going to start with Shane and then go to G, then Terry, then Thomas and Kaleo. So Shane, why don't you start by talking a little bit about how you got connected to the Fairies and how you got connected to Santa Cruz.
Well, I was living in San Diego. I was first connected with the Fairies and went to my very first gathering at the Malibu gathering in California. And that was at that time. And um, I got connected with the Fairies, and then I would go out to LA and actually visit with Harry Hay, and I would kind of sit at his feet and listen to him, and he would, you know, basically proselytize the whole time. And I loved every minute of it. And so I was a little Harry Hay protege for a while, and then I started doing my own gatherings with the LA Fairies. So the San Diego Fairies and the LA Fairies got together, did their first gathering, and that was at in the desert around LA, and that's where I first met a first group of Santa Cruz Fairies, and I was just amazed at how I was drawn to all of them. And it's true that the Santa Cruz Fairies are unlike other groups of fairies in that they seem to be and are so much more responsible and mature, it seems, and had jobs and could follow through with things. And I just was drawn completely. And so I ended up moving to Santa Cruz because of the fairies, because I met them all and I thought I want to live where they are. And so I came to Santa Cruz in the early 90s, and I've been here ever since. And so that's my story of coming to the Fairies.
Great, G, you're up.
Yeah, I arrived in Santa Cruz in '79 from a long road trip from Texas where I grew up. And I don't know exactly when, but I'm going to guess around 82 or so. I started having some fairy friends in my circles. I remember Thomas Reardon, who's here, and Scotty and Terry Kavanaugh. And one of the first things I remember about the fairies was just being told that I am a fairy. I can remember Thomas saying, "Gee, you're a fairy." And I didn't know what he meant or what that meant, but I took it in a good way, that this was something, a good thing. And so that encouraged me to go to a gathering. Oh, the other part too, I had a conversation with Terry about gatherings. He had been to one already. And so I was trying to figure out, well, what's the gathering about? What's it like? And what I remember from that conversation was he said, well, it's magic. It's magical. And yeah, what's that? You know, I didn't know what that meant exactly. And I guess you can't really describe that, but it intrigued me. So in '83, fall of '83, I went to my first gathering. It was up in Napa, on this beautiful land that was co-owned by several gay men. I drove up there in my Toyota pickup with Terry Kavanaugh and Robin White, who now lives in Oakland. He was a Santa Cruz Fairy. And that was my first gathering, which was amazing and freaky and scary and lovely, everything. You know, it kind of blew me away. And then for some reason, I didn't go to a second gathering until '86. And that was also a Napa gathering. And at that point, I befriended one of the owners, who was an architect, owners of the Napa land. And then I don't remember the details, but developed a conversation with him. And we had what we call a tofu gathering in '87, where it was mostly Santa Cruz Fairies with some others, but it was a smaller gathering. And yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. That was my first gatherings, my introduction to the Fairies.
Great. And Terry, what brought you to Santa Cruz and how are you connected to the Fairies?
I moved to Santa Cruz in '82, I think. I was about 26 years old. I moved there because I had a friend that had gone to UC Santa Cruz. And so I'd come down to visit him, and I thought it was a pretty great place. We both moved from the Midwest to the California. Well, I moved out to California, and then this friend followed me a year later, very dear friend of mine. And I ended up going to UC Berkeley. He ended up going to UC Santa Cruz. I thought he got the better deal, really. UC Santa Cruz was a lot more fun than UC Berkeley. And I found myself living in the Bay Area and then moving to Santa Cruz when I needed a change. There was a time when San Francisco was so intense in the 70s. You know, I moved there 78, 79, 80. it was literally throbbing. The sexual energy was so intense that a young man, 20, 23 years old like myself, would just get caught up in this intense energy. And I needed a quieter and wanted a quieter community. And I'd already discovered the Fairies before I'd moved to Santa Cruz. And so when I came to Santa Cruz, I just brought that energy and that connection with me. And I liked everything that I found in Santa Cruz and lived there for 30 years. It was perfect for me. It was only an hour and a half from San Francisco if I needed to get back up into San Francisco and visit old friends there, or go dancing, or have a connection with a bigger nightclub or cultural arena. So I was very happy to live in Santa Cruz, and we did have and still have a very strong core group of a fairy circle in Santa Cruz today. I'll leave it there to open.
Great. Thomas, do you want to add into that?
Add into what?
What
Thomas.
what brought you to Santa Cruz, and how are you connected to the Fairies?
Okay, well, the connection to the Fairies came first because I was living in San Francisco in the late 70s in the Haight-Ashbury, and there was a strong community of gay people, and we kind of stuck together because as kind of hippies we were shunned by the Castro gays because we didn't really conform to the clone stereotype. So we had a core group, and like Joey Kane and George Hare and people from Bound Together Books, which was the anarchist collective. And some of these friends went to a fairy gathering in New Mexico in '79, and I was afraid that, you know, going with a bunch of anarchists to the desert might not end well. So I waited, and December 1980, I went to my first gathering in Harbin Hot Springs. That was my first fairy gathering. And I had agreed to house sit in Santa Cruz for a month of December. And I told the people who I was house sitting for that I would come after the gathering. So so that's how I moved to Santa Cruz. I came to house sit. Just before I house sat, I went to this gathering and I met people like Sean Laughing Tree and Scotty Brookie. And, you know, among the 200 men, somehow I felt a real instant kinship with these two. I remember thinking like they could be my brothers. This was my first gathering. I got to know them a little bit at the gathering. And after the gathering, I became closer with Sean and Scotty. We're all still pretty close. We became intertwined with each other's lives. And Sean actually I ended up moving into a room he was renting in his house. And I became a co-worker at the place he was working at in Santa Cruz. So the before and after the gathering was completely different. It was a real nice series of coincidences. And so Santa Cruz has remained my primary home since 1980. And I think one of the things that when we went to gatherings, the other fairies always would remark that Santa Cruz has a proportionally large presence at fairy gatherings. So that's all I would need to say right now. I keep hearing background noise though.
Yeah, I keep finding the people, and I'll mute them.
Okay, thanks.
There we go.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's great. Kaleo, you want to talk a little bit about how you came to Santa Cruz and how you got connected to the Fairies?
Yeah, sure. I came to Santa Cruz in 1989, January of 1989. I had, interestingly, gone with G. G was a friend of mine. I'd been coming over to Santa Cruz maybe for a year or two already, mostly to gay volleyball on Wednesdays, and was starting to develop some nice friendships, including with G. And I think this kind of represents the whole fairy thing. It's sort of like each one teach one, or it's word of mouth, or, you know, that you bring someone you know into a gathering that you think might enjoy that. So I got fired from a job, which is the best thing that ever happened to me, I think, one of the best things. And so I moved, and I'd been wanting to move to Santa Cruz. And so I did that in January 1989. My first gathering was in '88. And That was, I believe it was the same place that G mentioned in Napa County. Yeah, G's nodding his head, yes. It's again, it was owned by, I guess, 2, 3, 4 maybe gay men. I think mostly lived most of the time in the city. So G brought me along. We went up together, and I was immediately like, whoa. I mean, one of the things we greet each other with when you're first arriving to a gathering is welcome home. And I just really felt that way, and just had such a immediate and deep, thrilling connection with all the folks there. Yeah.
Great. So I'm curious from all of you, and maybe Terry and Thomas can start with this, to share a little bit about a little history of the fairy movement and how the movement got started in Santa Cruz. So, you know, how did it start at the very beginning? So I'm not sure if Terry or Thomas want to start with that.
Well, I'll start, and Thomas can fill in what I forget or get wrong or get mixed up. The first fairy gathering was in 1979 in a retreat in the desert in Arizona, and it was called by 4 men, Harry Hay, Mitch Walker, John Kilhefner, and I guess Harry's partner, John Burnside. And it was attended by about 200, 220 people. It was before the internet, before cell phones. The invitation was posted at various bookstores in the gay section, or gay bookstores in particular, and on the circuit of alternative people. And really, people were looking for an alternative way of being queer, and not supporting Castro clone mentality, not supporting assimilation, looking at being queer as something really deeper and maybe spiritual, and in search of our sense of spirituality as a population. What is the reason that we're here? Let's explore that. A lot's been written about this. It's many books, many articles, but that's the beginning of it. And it was such a popular and profound impact that week gathering, that there was another one that happened like within the next year. I think in Colorado there was 250 people, I think, at the second big gathering in Colorado. And then after that, it just started to spin. I think I was at my first gathering at Harbin Hot Springs, as Thomas noted, in 1981. It was the only gathering we've only had at Harbin Hot Springs, because we were a little too radical for them at the time. Very free-flowing sexuality, very sexuality affirming, very spiritual affirming for gay men, very in search of who we are. Also, I would say we are in alignment with feminism and the constructs of what feminism offers men, not just in support of women, but also what does feminism mean if you're a man, in terms of dissecting and taking apart, disintegrating the machismo and all of its negative parts, so that the softer and more feminine and fey elements of our personalities and of our quality and character could shine and be present and be prominent. And that's a very significant element of what the fairies represent and what they support. So you will see often a fairy kind of a presence or an inkling, and many drag artists and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence were simultaneously developing, and maybe came and developed similarly to the fairies, progressing, intertwining at the same time. They're very connected to who we are. We certainly came out of a set of values that embraced the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, the gay civil rights movement, and feminism. And that's really kind of where it comes out of. And all of these things were very prominent in Santa Cruz as well. I mean, Santa Cruz, having UC Santa Cruz there, a very liberal, very liberal campus, supported all of this. You know, Santa Cruz for a time was kind of a hippie, alternative town. I mean, prior to that, it was a conservative retirement community. But when the university arrived and UC Santa Cruz got here and took its place, a lot of things shifted. And there was a lot of eco activism, and all of this was in the support of the fairies, or the fairies were in support of all of these issues. It was all in our ethos and in the ambience of what we believed in and what we wanted to celebrate and articulate. So, Thomas, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
How about, so at the beginning, how did you all get together in Santa Cruz? I'm curious about that piece. I know the gathering piece, but how did you end up continuing to meet in Santa Cruz?
I would say we were continuing to meet at gatherings. That's mainly where, in the beginning, in the 1980s, we were going to gatherings in Harbin Hot Springs, no, not Harbin Hot Springs, but in Napa, like G was saying, and eventually out at Wolf Creek. There were also gatherings happening in Southern California, and we would, the fairies from Santa Cruz would migrate out and go to gatherings around the state mainly, and we were a community. We'd ride together. We would set up agreements, but mainly the gatherings that were happening in the 80s were outside of Santa Cruz, and we would have our own group of Santa Cruz people who would hang out together at times at the gathering, but most of the time integrating with other people at gatherings. So during the beginning period, the Santa Cruz Fairies were a presence at other gatherings, and we would have, and then also we became intertwined in each other's lives pretty intimately and supportively. So that was for me how I built my friendships for my whole life, was a lot of during those years of being a Santa Cruz Fairy and meeting fairies from other parts of the state and other parts of the world.
Great.
I went to that first gathering in 1981, with Thomas was there, and I drove up with Alan Lamb, who's a Santa Cruzan, who's a former supervisor of mental health for South County and recently retired. And we did workshops and fairy sweat lodges and rituals around Alan's house. We would have a monthly potluck and a heart circle is a routine thing. I think it's been going on 25 years, I would guess. I don't remember the first one in particular, because when we talk about the Santa Cruz Fairies, sometimes we talk about the Santa Cruz area radical fairies, SCA,
Scarf.
RF.
Scarf.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And so we have people from San Francisco who have been so enamored and connected with that core group, as Shane mentioned earlier, about the strength of the solidity of this community, that people would come down from Santa Cruz, or from San Francisco, or Oakland or the Bay Area, or even up from LA, and attend gatherings or just hang out with us.
Were there other people want to add to that? Go ahead.
Yeah. What I've noticed is that the Santa Cruz area radical fairies have gone through cycles, I would say, of various levels of cohesion and activity. And so what Terry was mentioning in the earlier days, there was a lot focused around Alan's beautiful land. He had this beautiful spacious land and this great sort of, not exactly a hot tub, but an indoor hot water thing that was always fun. And we would have weekend retreats there, and up to maybe 20 or so people. And I think that was a place where people got more deeply connected. And then I'm trying to remember my history a little bit, but that was, I would say it's starting in the late 80s, early 90s. And then Shane came to town, and and Shane was brought a lot of energy and passion and vision, and so he launched numerous things. And that, to my mind, that feels like a whole nother episode. Era. That's the word. Thank you. Era.
Yeah.
So
When Shane was in charge. That's what he said, anyway.
You know how it is with fairies. No one's really in charge. Whoever thinks they
Tell
might.
Shane.
Yeah. I wanted to say a few things about what I think as I'm listening to everybody talk, some of the things I think have made Santa Cruz sort of like a little hotbed of fairy activity. Terry mentioned about the liberal, the college and stuff like that, sort of the hippie vibe, so that fits in there. The proximity to San Francisco, which was a sort of very central in many ways. But I think many of us came to Santa Cruz also because of the nature, because of the beaches and the redwoods, which, is a fairy trait. Nature lovers, earth, sort of loving of the Mother Earth. And I think also the size of Santa Cruz has really worked to our advantage, where we could be more cohesive than many other communities. I think that's one thing that's allowed us to kind of hang together. Like San Francisco is almost like too big, and got a little more fractious, I think. So I think those all were things that help make Santa Cruz a strong fairy community.
So Shane, do you want to talk a little bit about, you talked earlier about what brought you to Santa Cruz, and when you arrived, do you want to talk a little bit about those early days of moving to Santa Cruz?
Well, what Kaleo said is somewhat correct in that I arrived and then tried to control everything. But
I didn't say that.
well, I would say that. But the honest truth is that when I came to Santa Cruz, within 3 months, I was partnered with Terry. And so the two of us together were quite a dynamic focus, and our house became a focus for the Fairies for so many activities. And I did decide to put together and facilitate to make sure they happened heart circles on a monthly basis for almost a decade in Santa Cruz. And so, all the parades were also done in our backyard between the two houses that we lived at. And so there was a lot of activity that happened, as Kaleo talked about, when Terry and I were together. It was really, I would say, like the golden days of Santa Cruz. We did so many amazing things. Casbah Cabarets, which were youth-focused charity events, really, for us to raise funds for youth. And then I did put together the queer camps, and then of course I just organized them all. I was a psychologist and worked with youth, but then all the fairies were involved in those camps, so we all participated in them, and we all participated in the floats. And Cobra and Sandy, of course, were the main architects and artists for the floats, and we all just seemed to work well together as a group. And that's one of the things I love about us even today, is that we're amazingly good at working together, utilizing all of our skill sets in a way that honors all of us. And I just love the Santa Cruz Fairies because of that.
Well, help me understand what the affinity with outreach to youth was for all of you, because you were all involved in some ways. Why that particular group?
I know that for myself, that a lot of us were already involved with in organizations that were helping queer youth, or were in some way volunteering, or that was a focus of our work. That would be what I would say. What do other people think about that?
Well, I'm trying to remember details. But Terry, weren't you and I both involved in the early meetings of that organization focused on queer youth? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. The issue with queer youth, a lot of it came out of the AIDS epidemic. And, the Santa Cruz Fairies, by the way, in addition to supporting queer youth, have supported a huge amount of activities for the wider gay community. I mean, not only did we do the float and look colorful every year, but there was a point at which I could point out the number of fairies who've been past board presidents and board members of the Diversity Center, and people who are the executive directors of the Diversity Center have all been Santa Cruz Fairies. I mean, one year the mayor gave the Santa Cruz Fairies an award at Gay Pride, and all 25 of us got up there in our costumes, and it was in general service to the community that that we were recognized for. So queer youth in particular, for example, there was a period at which we started to recognize that people were getting infected when they were 17, 18 years old, so that the outreach to the bars, for example, at 21 and older, didn't even begin to get impactful. because we knew from life experience that people started to have sex at 17, 18, or 20, and that we needed to reach people at an earlier age. And so one of our attempts was to do outreach in the schools. We went to the schools, large high schools in Santa Cruz County that had 3,000 students, and they said, well, we don't really know that we have any gay students. I mean, I can think of one. We recognized there was a major problem there. And this wasn't the Fairies per se, but Kaleo and I and Kate and a number of people were on committees trying to do outreach. And then we recognized that, you know, this is the formation of the Queer Youth Leadership Awards, for example, and concerns about queer youth. We also recognized the queer camp was be a good idea to give people the opportunity to connect in healthy alternative ways before the difficult challenges of society started to mount up, the risk for drug abuse and everything else.
I'm remembering a little bit more now. So it was the Queer Youth Task Force that was formed whenever it was, probably 1990 or so. And, you know, there was definitely a good representation of fairies on there, but it was much wider than that. But I think maybe you were definitely one of the main instigators, Terry. But we started to meet just to focus on queer youth. It wasn't just HIV at all related, but that became a part of it. And then, you know, I got a job working in HIV prevention. I was recruited to enroll young queer men in an HIV, a survey actually, which became the control study for a larger multi-city National Institute of Mental Health grant, of which Santa Cruz became, unbeknownst to me, became the first community to receive this intervention. And I became the coordinator, program director, whatever, of that project, which then became a part of the Santa Cruz AIDS project. Within, I left, and it had 2 or 3 other names and iterations under the umbrella of the Santa Cruz AIDS project. But that was a major, in my mind, organizing, like all of HIV was, organizing energy in the community for queer men, young gay men. And community building was instrumental to that there had to be a there to target. And so we tried to create a there through all kinds of events and outreach and so forth.
Are there other memories of those 80s and 90s? It sounds like many of you were part of all those different events at Shane and Terry's house, or some of the other things. What are some of those memories that the rest of you have?
I think the other important thing to bring up is that a lot of us were involved in Nominus, because we needed to have a site that we could all go to for gathering, somewhere where we could gather. And so one of the early things that we did in the early 80s was decide that we needed a place to go. We went to this gathering at Wolf Creek, and we decided, yeah, this is the kind of place we were envisioning. So we got together and fundraised and purchased the land back in the early to mid 80s. So I think Nominus, and then also, as someone mentioned, you know, just HIV/AIDS support, we were all involved in that as well in the early days. So we were, you know, Fairies, we were a community looking for fun, and eventually we did some of those other things.
I would say also, you know, these things went hand in glove. I did the work for the Santa Cruz AIDS Project for 4 very intense years, from 89 to 91, or 87 to 91, excuse me. And it was very intense work. People were dying every month, and they weren't just strangers, clients, they were our friends. It was our community. It was extremely challenging with a lot of uncertainty. And I really couldn't have done that work without the support of this brotherhood, tribal nature of this support group that was part of my life, that was built in. I mean, it wouldn't have been possible for me to have done that. And later I went on and taught at the university, and then I got my master's degree in social work, all of which was infinitely easier because of this extremely strong social support network that I was part of and involved in. And I think we all pulled the best out of each other almost at all times. I don't ever remember this being a circle or a collection where we split or we had a huge fight or we hurt each other, ever.
Yeah, and I would say
Um,
the reason why I was able to do so much of what I've done in my life is because of the support of the Santa Cruz Fairies. Truly, there's been so many difficult things that, I mean, all of us, but myself, I'm thinking about right now, that I've endured in this life since knowing the fairies. And the reason, strength and the compassion and the ability to get through some of these events was always because I had the support of my community, of my circle here in Santa Cruz.
one of the things we haven't talked about is the heart circle, which is kind of the core element of a fairy gathering. And also we have heart circles at Shane's house and around town. And as Terry mentioned, with the AIDS crisis, as we're going through that, those heart circles were, I think, instrumental for us in dealing with our feelings and emotions around our fears and seeing our friends get sick. And we were exposed to people who were quite sick and, even very close to death, who were in these circles just telling us their deepest truth. So we all learned a lot about each other and ourselves, and we still do. They're still quite powerful.
G, you want to talk a little bit about the structure of a heart circle for people that don't know what that means?
Sure. Basically, we gather in a circle, and in the middle we'll have a talisman or kind of an altar, some kind of an object. And we might call directions. We might just sort of set the space a little bit, get people settled. And then we can either go around in a circle or do it popcorn style. But basically, whoever has the talisman is the person who basically has the attention. And the idea is you speak from your heart. And you can be quiet. You could even sing a song or pass, whatever you like. But that you stay with your heart and everybody listens. There's not crosstalk, there's not commentary or advice, or we just allow people to say what they need to say. And it goes around, and it's quite an amazing process because you listen to other people and that will stimulate your own feelings and emotions, and it can go quite deep. It can be a quite powerful, cathartic experience.
Shane, you want to add to that?
You did a great job. I don't have a lot to add from what G said. I mean, I agree that the heart of our community, so to speak. That's where we all learn to support each other so well, and how we continue to know what's happening on the deepest level in our lives. And I know that for me, similar to what Terry said in the beginning, the fairies in general really uphold our feminine, soft, vulnerable parts in men. As well as drag, or the gathering where we get to dress however we want to dress. There's a way where our color, our vulnerability, our femininity, our hearts are easily present and upheld in a very loving way.
And so if I heard correct, go ahead, Cleo, sorry.
Well, one thing that hasn't been talked about that I think is important to add in there is the importance, what actually happens at a gathering, and the importance of ritual, which I think was really especially important, definitely the heart circles during sort of the height of the AIDS crisis, but also the rituals that we created to both honor our experience, whatever it might be, the losses, the illness, the rites of passage. Taking on a fairy name is, can be a ritual, but it's symbolic of, as Shane was mentioning, perhaps trying on and a different part of ourselves and allowing that part of ourselves to become more present in our lives. Something we might want to cultivate, and having the support of other people calling us that name suddenly, I think that can be really empowering. And so the things that happen at gatherings we would create rituals. The no talent show I think of as a ritual, and that's definitely a tradition that happens at pretty much every gathering, where people are encouraged to just share themselves. It could be anything, really. Anything would qualify as no talent, or whatever you wanted to call it. But just this idea of getting up on stage and sharing yourself in complete support, usually, with your fellow tribe. And there's just some amazing memories that I have, and I'm sure everyone on this call has, who's been to a gathering of talent shows where people have done outrageous things, incredibly beautiful things. Just magic can really, really happen on the stage.
So it sounds like that the heart circle were monthly at your house, Shane. Is that what you were saying? So that for, I don't know, 10 years on a monthly basis, you were all getting together and connecting in many different ways, it sounds like.
Yeah, prior to me coming to Santa Cruz, Heart Circle still happened, but not as regularly. And then when Terry and I got together and bought a house together, then we started having them there. And I just happened to decide to commit to doing it every month, and it was for 10 years. And then after that, we still have Heart Circles, but they're less regular. And nowadays, Terry and I live separately, so it's only my house now, so we still have them at my house primarily, but they happen at other people's houses as well. Yes.
I should mention we're doing Zoom Heart Circles. We had a beautiful one that Jane facilitated. Included a May Day ritual where we burned some things and danced around our bowls, and then we sat down and had a heart circle and shared just like we normally do. It was lovely.
Did you say that we danced around our balls?
Bowls. And balls, all of it.
Sure, why not?
Sure.
As the case may be.
Are there other events or memories that you have from the 80s and 90s in those early years of Santa Cruz, or the things that you impacted in Santa Cruz because of your existence?
I'd like to mention too the gatherings we had in Big Sur on John Kinder's land. Beautiful, beautiful property that was available to us for many years. And the Santa Cruz Fairies, we were the main connection to the owner and kind of the host for that gathering. And they definitely, I think, helped our community to get closer, be tighter knit, and expand the community. There were quite a few people from the Bay Area, San Francisco, that attended. So that was a beautiful part of our history.
I wanted to also mention, although Terry did mention it, Terry was one of the people that was the founder, really, of the Queer Youth Leadership Awards. So I just want to make sure that his name got paired to that. And also, we used to do Easter parades, which were hilarious. We would all dress up in fabulous costumes and then parade through the streets, handing out candy and stuff for the kids. And then we would parade up to the Catholic church in town and sit on their lawn and have a tea party, like a Mad Hatter's tea party in front of them as they got on Sunday morning at Easter. It was really fun.
I think the Fairies for the 80s and 90s continued to be part of what kept Santa Cruz weird, for sure. Adding color and flavor and our own particular style. But I also think, again, the infrastructure, in a sense, of who we are, or the connection of who we are as a connected group, support group, was very influential in holding up the greater structures of the Diversity Center, the Community Center, the AIDS Project, the Queer Youth Awards, Outreach to Youth, Care for Elders. You know, a lot of this was done not necessarily by this group, but very much supported by this group. I mean, we were very core and instrumental to a lot of what was going on. And I wouldn't say we started everything, but we supported a lot of what was good for the community, was good for us. And we were there and we made a lot of that happen. And we still are doing that in a sense. I mean, it was the Santa Cruz Fairies that I came to, for example, in the very first global gathering that I organized with Chaz Knoll, who's on this call, and a bunch of other people in 2014. It was the Santa Cruz Fairies that I went to and I said, hey, can we use our our Santa Cruz Fairie 501(c)(3) status to raise money to bring people from Africa and Asia and Europe and all over the world, and Russia. And the Santa Cruz Fairies said yes and embraced this. And that was typical of the Santa Cruz Fairies to be able to do that. And so, you know, they're still core, they're still instrumental. And I think this goes back to what you mentioned earlier, Rob, about Santa Cruz's outsized leverage or outsized influence. For the small community that it is, we're an ideal kind of sanctuary of gay rights and gay development in a way. We've been very privileged and done a lot.
Other thoughts?
Well, I could say something about.
Go right ahead.
We've kind of presented the fairies and lauded, you know, the Santa Cruz fairy community, and I believe everything that everyone has shared about it. And one of the things that though makes me sad is I feel like there hasn't been a lot of young blood coming up and taking the reins. And that saddens me. And I think we all just sort of keep looking for that to happen. And, you know, look at the folks on the call. We're all like, you know, at least in our 50s and older, and, you know, older for sure. So I don't know, you know, if the world's changing all the time. But I do have some hope that, I don't know. I don't know what to think about that, actually, but I do have some sadness about it.
Well, I have an analysis of that. You know, I remember Shane 10, 15 years ago saying, I'm really concerned because I don't see younger people joining us. But what I think has happened, particularly in Santa Cruz, is that it got gentrified, and it's a matter of economics. When I moved to Santa Cruz, you know, it wasn't any more expensive than anywhere else in the Bay Area. It was accessible and it was cheaper to live, just like it was in the rest of the Bay Area. And it just got incredibly gentrified. And the difference between San Francisco and Santa Cruz is that in San Francisco, the rents are outrageous, but the jobs are comparable. In Santa Cruz, if you're not a professional, if you're not a doctor or a lawyer, or you already own your home, you're not going to make it in a long range. You can't come there and be a waiter and get settled and be established. You're always going to be highly, highly marginal. So if you're a grounded person or you're looking for more and you're 25 or 35 years old, it's very, very hard to settle in Santa Cruz without some kind of an economic leg up, like your parents left you a house or something like that. A lot of this is economics. The rest of the world, the fairy world, there are many fairies in their 20s and 30s and 40s who are very dynamically engaged all over the rest of the world. And, you know, we're talking about 10,000 to 20,000, you know, fairies worldwide, engaged people in this circle. It's just Santa Cruz that the economics have made it difficult. That's my analysis.
Terry, where is that happening in the U.S. with young people?
Well, in Oregon, I mean, I go to parties in Portland, and there's many people in their 20s and 30s. I'm going to a birthday party for a 26-year-old tomorrow, a dear friend of mine. My partner, who's a fairy, is at home. He's 32 years old. He went back to Utah for a little while to see his family. I mean, it's a very dynamic community in Portland, very wide range in ages. It's not unusual for us to be sitting around and doing groups and being in the ages of 25 to 85, a whole cross-generational experience, which, by the way, was another major issue that I found very significant when I got married. I didn't find that in any other gay men's groups, just age brand. And so that's a distinction.
I also feel that an aspect is when I talk to queer youth, especially much younger though, when I talk to adolescents or people in their 20s, they oftentimes talk about they don't really want to go to a group that's primarily gay men oriented. So
Yeah.
they oftentimes still also feel like it doesn't seem like they're as wounded as we were, honestly, because they're more accepted and they feel more acceptable. And so they don't have the same needs we did is another aspect of it, I think.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because us older gay men, many of us were, maybe we weren't kicked out of our families, but we were not really accepted in our blood families. And then when we came out and found gay community, many of us didn't feel that like we were a good fit in that community either. And so back then, the Fairies were our family. That was the one place that many of us felt like we finally found our people, our tribe. And that may not be so true today, as Shane was alluding to.
So as a way to close up this particular part of the webinar, the recorded part, I'd love to hear from each one of you just to kind of think about what the long-term legacy has been. You've kind of touched on it, but I'd love to hear kind of your final concluding thoughts based on this conversation of what the personal experience or the professional experience that it meant for you and for future generations, and what that impact in the long term has been for you and for the overall community. And I'm going to start with Shane on that, then G, then Terry, then Thomas, and Kaleo. You'll get the final word.
Okay, so for me, I think the legacy of the Fairies is multifactorial. That I think we still bring this perspective that who we are as queer people, which is from Harry Hay, who we are as queer people is something unique and special and is needed for the majority of the culture. That why we come together is to heal each other first, to support each other first, and then find our gifts for the rest of the culture, and to give back to the, not only to our community, but the non-queer community in ways that are helpful for them. I feel like we're still needed for sure as this world becomes more difficult to be in all the time. And also legacy pieces are that we have just all the things we've done in Santa Cruz. We have a book that shows that. We have a CD for Chance. We have all these organizations we've been in. And so a lot of our legacy is just within organizations that are still strong and that continue forward to honor so many people and to help so many people.
G?
Yeah. Yeah, I think initially we came together to learn who we were, as it's been said, what our gifts were, what our place in the world is, and for healing, because many of us were quite wounded, as gay men growing up in the 70s. So, getting in touch with our hearts, I think that's a huge gift. That was something that might have been missing in the larger gay community. And also, I think bringing spirituality into the practice. And it, typically would show up more in a Wiccan or pagan or earth-based kind of a thing. But other ways as well, many spiritual traditions, many of them less conventional, than what we normally see. Focus on nature and celebrating our sexuality, something that we were taught to be ashamed of and, you had to do in the dark and private, and that we celebrated that, this was something to love other men and to do it sort of openly was something to be proud of and to celebrate.
Terry?
I think one thing I want to highlight is that we're interviewing 5 Fairies, and the Fairies are a very non-hierarchical group. And some of us have been around longer, but we're not necessarily a full representation. I mean, Kwai is not here, Cobra and Sandy are not here. There's other people on this call who haven't had a voice in this conversation. And I just want to acknowledge that part of the nature of our collectiveness is very horizontal and non-hierarchical. So, this is a slice. This is just a little slice of a few people's voices about the Fairies. I just want to say that. And then I would say the strongest legacy for me, and it hasn't changed, is that I have not found any other group of queer men who ask the question, who are we? Why are we here and where are we going? Or what is the authentic reason that there are queer people? I mean, essentially, that is a question that when you ask people like, well, why are there gay people? You don't people just kind of roll their eyes like, well, there's theories, evolutionary theories, like, well, if there's an extra adult that's unmarried in the tribe, then the nephews and the nieces survive better. I mean, all this theoretical stuff, and that may or may not be true, but in the modern age, we still keep showing up in the gene pool. We're a population that's completely immune from genocide. They could gather all the queer people in America or Russia or Europe or all over the world and kill us all, and in a generation we'll be back. So why is that? The radical fairies essentially, philosophically and spiritually, ask the question, who are we? In a deeper level than any other group that I've ever met. So that, I think, is our essential legacy. It's a deep core question.
Thomas?
Well, yeah, I agree with Terry that this is really just a group of the rich white men of Santa Cruz, and we don't represent everybody. But as far as our legacy goes, I think that what I see as coming out of our organization of Fairies is a sense of community, of friendship, of caring for each other, supporting for each other. And also there's been multinational growth. I mean, now there are Fairies all over the world of all ages and colors and languages. There's gatherings happening in Europe and in Australia and Spain and Portugal and all over the place. And I think that this is something that, we were the part of the beginning of, and we've watched it grow. And it's also nourished us as a community and made us stronger and able to reach out outside of our own communities and make our town and eventually, our world a better place in some ways. And I'm proud of all of us for that.
Kaleo, final words.
So much has been said. Well, first, I don't identify as white and rich. And,
that was just a joke.
Okay.
Sorry.
But, that's part of the fairy culture, is to honor difference and in some ways, contrarian ways of being. So legacy, I would say, what I think about is that we've been able to create spaces where people can discover essentially at the essential level who they are, who our unique gifts are, what our unique gifts are, and how we can live our life's purpose, and contribute each person's, let's say, genius to the larger community. And I think that extends well beyond queer people.
Great. I want to thank all of you for all that you've shared. As we finish the recording here, I will make sure that the resources that Shane talked about are part of those resources for people that are interested in them. And I would like to invite other people who are part of the Fairy group sometime in June. It'd be fun to do this and just kind of have a Fairy story hour that people could talk more about the Fairy stories that they all have to include as part of this. So at this part, I just want to thank everybody, and I'm going to stop the recording right now.